Our fourth speaker is Professor Julie Bernhardt. Julie's head of the Stroke Division at the Florey Institute for Neuroscience and Mental Health. She's a physiotherapist, a clinician researcher, and co-chair of the Australian Stroke Trials Network. Julie spearheads the first Stroke Rehabilitation and Recovery Roundtable, an international consortium of stroke experts who are setting new agreed standards for recovery research. So she's well placed to provide for us the global perspective on measuring the impact of Australian-led trials and registries internationally. Thanks, Julie.
Thanks very much for the invitation. I'm going to start by saying I can't really give you the answer of the impact because it's one of those things, as Steve said, it's an unknown, I think. But let's talk about some of the things that we do know. So many of you in this room will be familiar with this report that came out last year, commissioned by the NHMRC, and looking at the Australian networks. Many of us contributed to these networks, and it was a 10-year snapshot of what do we know about the practices and impact of our clinical trials networks. And so the rough data are that we've got over 1,000 clinical trials in that report, with 10,000 plus researchers and an estimated over 1 million participants in trials. So it's pretty impressive about what Australia is doing for research. If we think about the impact, though, the international impact of research, we know less about it. So even if we just look at the impact on clinical practice or policy, when asked and to provide information from the networks about how many of our studies actually had impact on clinical practice or policies, it's around 98. That's not insignificant at all, as we've heard even just in this session. And of course, many of them are published in high-impact journals. And of course, we collaborate very extensively in Australia. So we have a lot of international collaborations, both with us as the drivers of the research and us participating in international trials. And this also comes from the report showing that we have many examples of multinational consortia that we're involved in, and the top 4 sites for research. You can see we collaborate a lot with our colleagues in Canada, the UK, United States and France, and also with our region, although to a less extent. So if I reflect on the Australian Stroke Trials Network, it's been running for 19 years. It's both Australia and New Zealand as its primary, so it's an Australasian network, and we do have very extensive collaborations internationally. We've had over $150 million of funding into the network and 180 plus publications. And you can see on the right-hand side from the 2014 survey of 24 ongoing trials what it looks like. I'll come back to this because I think what I want to say is that one of the things that is reflective here is how important the volunteerism is in the Australian networks, and that's incredibly important. So I just thought I'd highlight 4 studies that have been conducted because of the known international impact on these studies. And I think, first of all, the Australian streptokinase kinase trial, the AST trial. Now, this is a trial that was conducted in the early 90s, and it was looking at a clot-busting drug for acute ischemic stroke. Now, the trial was stopped early for safety, but really did inform the importance of timing of administration, also dose of administration, and really spearheaded next trials that have led to new stroke treatments that are now level 1 evidence and considered best practice and widely adopted. The Extend IA trial is a recent study that was completed last year, and this is a smaller study but looking at clot retrieval in acute ischemic stroke, and again showing really important impacts and careful selection of patients. And this is part of an Australian trial but has been really part of a quite remarkable change in clinical care that is now spreading across the world around early IA treatment. Then the Enchanted trial, which is again an Australian-led trial, looking at control of hypertension and thrombolysis. And this really was showing that a lower dose is actually superior to a higher dose, and shifted practice, and you can see also economic benefit in being able to use less drug in treatment. And then my own study, which was Australian-led and international in nature, which was the first international rehabilitation trial, showed that an assumed benefit of starting intervention and rehabilitation very early after stroke onset was in fact the wrong thing to do. So this has changed mobility practice conversations globally, and in fact everyone's still in a bit of, wow, what do we do now? But they're already incorporated into clinical guidelines. And this is an example of where something that we felt strongly and from previous preliminary evidence looked good shouldn't be done. So there's a safety saving there in terms of what we're doing. So those are just some examples. Now, I think it's been mentioned previously that there's been again, a wonderful activity, and I thank the Australian Commission and ACTA for allowing me to just show this one slide, which is the cost-benefit estimate work that was happening in the last. The data again was gathered over this year, and this shows for our network the cost-benefit ratio of ASTN. It's estimated at 10 to 1 in a dollar value. And you can see here that in terms of the central costs and network costs, they're quite small in our network, and I'll come to that, but the benefits for improvements in quality of life and from avoiding direct service costs are significant. Now, the challenge, of course, is that we can't estimate the impact of these internationally, but certainly some of that is important for us to look at. So that report's going to be, I think, very important, and I can't wait to see it when it comes out. Now, coming back to the trial networking funding issue, just because I think I can't go without again saying how important it is that we get some sustainable funding around trials networks. So you recall the ASTN network, we've been very successful. This is how much we have in our budget for supporting the trial network. So there's enormous amounts of volunteerism that support the conduct of these internationally competitive trials. Now, how do we measure impact? We've already just had a brief look at this, and I won't go into detail in the interest of time. But I think that this definition, which Andrew Searles has coined as part of his the FATE framework for measuring impact for translational health research, the FATE, is important to think about, that it's looking at generating benefits for the economy, society, culture, national security, public policy, or the environment. It's a very broad brush look, and thinking about how we consider translation and impact. So in terms of measuring impact better, I think we all know that we need to go beyond just looking at where we get our papers published. Now, with the FATE, and I won't, as I said, I'll just be very brief, it's prospective. If you're going to change how we look at impact, we have to consider it prior to us embarking on it. So it really does encourage researchers to seek out activities that really are going to be reflective in the scorecard on payback to society. We have to develop customised metrics, and it uses a qualitative and quantitative approach. So it's not simple, and I don't think any of us would expect it to be simple to measure impact in a better way. There's bidirectional impacts, and there's encouraging monitoring and feedback. So in terms of what this looks like, I just wanted to share this, which you've seen just in the previous one. I don't expect you to be able to read it, but we have decided in our CRE for stroke rehabilitation that we want to use this framework. So we've had to go through a process of looking at the demands and across different user groups. If we think of our clinical trials, what are we trying to achieve? What are the activities, the outcomes? What are the measurable outputs? And then this one, of course, which is the impact, the benefit, and what are we going to, who are going to use our outputs And I think that that's really important. So the cost can be compared against the benefit in this framework. So this is a work in progress. I don't have any data to share with you about that. But just to quickly take you through an example. So this is an example of an emergency department presentation for residents in aged care. You have to look at the needs, the aims, the measurable outcomes, the impact, and it's a logic map. And so you've got your needs, you've got your aims, what you're trying to reduce, and what you're trying to get in terms of guidelines, and what the impacts might be on researchers, health systems, patients and families, and then you can measure that. And costs can be compared. So I think for me, measuring the impact of Australian-led clinical trials, I think we all recognise that our trials are world-class, innovative and change practice. That's great. How do we measure the impact? I don't really have the answer to that yet. I think this is something that we really need to work hard on. Assessing the worth of our trials on the international space is really limited at present by standards and systems and funding to enable networks to gather the data needed. And this became very clear when we were trying to contribute to the data for a number of the activities from ACTA. So just knowing what we're doing, knowing how many patients and knowing how much funding has come into the system, if we don't gather it, we can't share that. And we also don't have a model for examining the impact beyond the basics, and I think this is where there's work in progress. I think the other issues that we have are the challenges of the timing of impact not always being clear. There's long tails in a lot of work. And the issue of the registries and how we can take snapshots looking at changing practice, I think, is extremely valuable. And understanding our impact internationally is also significantly challenging because of the fact that we are required to have a look at what's happening elsewhere. So there's obviously a huge and important role for collaboration across different issues. And so just finally, I think registries are vital, of course, for efficient gathering of data on impact and practice. And one of the challenges that we have is developing sustainable models for funding of registries so that we actually can have this valuable resource present. And so thanks to all my colleagues who helped collect data for ASTM. Thank you.